The air was thick with tension as the world around her buzzed with indifference. A woman, worn by life's harshest realities, sat on the cold, unforgiving pavement, her eyes reflecting a battle fought and lost. Her clothes, torn and threadbare, whispered stories of days long gone. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a woman who had served, fought for a country that seemed to have forgotten her. But that night, as she clutched her coat tighter, there was something in the air that felt different, something that would alter the course of her life forever. Across the street, a figure approached, a man she never thought she would meet. His presence was commanding, his movements deliberate, yet something about his gaze seemed out of place. He wasn't here by accident. He wasn't here just to pass by. He was here for a reason, one that would shock not only her, but everyone watching. What happens next is beyond belief. A moment that will question everything she thought she knew about compassion, power, and redemption. And it all begins with one simple act. The woman. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, a woman who once stood tall with pride. She was a soldier, someone who had fought for the country, for the people who now walked past her without a second glance. Her uniform had once fit her perfectly, a symbol of her service and strength. But now, her uniform was a distant memory, buried beneath layers of hardship and the cold embrace of the streets. Sarah had enlisted in the military as a way to escape the suffocating small-town life, to prove to herself that she could be more than what her past dictated. She was young, hopeful, and eager to serve. But the years in the service took more than just her innocence. The wars, the endless battles, the lives lost, each moment chipped away at her, leaving scars far deeper than any physical wound. When she returned home, expecting a hero's welcome, she was met instead with a country too distracted, too indifferent to recognize her sacrifice. Her desires now were simple: survival. Every day was a battle against the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, the ache in her heart, the despair that had taken root deep within. But there was one thing that kept her going: hope. Hope that one day, someone would see her for who she once was, someone would care enough to offer her the hand she had extended so many times to others. It was that fragile hope that kept her eyes from closing in defeat. But Sarah's world was cold and unforgiving. The streets offered no warmth, no compassion. Yet, in the deepest part of her heart, there lingered a thought that maybe, just maybe, tonight might be different. The man. Then there was him, Donald Trump. To the world, he was an enigma, a symbol of power, wealth, and controversy. His name carried weight, and his reputation was built on a foundation of ambition and decisions that had both uplifted and divided millions. But behind the headlines, behind the polished suit and confident demeanor, was a man who, too, was shaped by his own set of desires and fears. Trump had built an empire, a legacy that was both revered and reviled, but the price of that success had been steep. The world saw him as a leader, a businessman, a force to be reckoned with, but he had never let the world see the man behind the public persona. What was he really searching for? Respect, validation, or something deeper? A sense of purpose that no amount of money or power could ever fulfill. He had everything a man could want, yet the emptiness inside him grew with every passing year. He had made decisions that had shattered lives, yet no one seemed to truly understand the weight of those choices, the toll it had taken on his conscience. Was he the hero of his own story, or was he the villain? As he moved through life, surrounded by yes-men and sycophants, the world's expectations weighed heavily on him. But there were moments, fleeting yet intense, when he caught glimpses of something more, something beyond the suit, the title, and the endless streams of money. He knew he was at a crossroads. What would his legacy be? How would history remember him? Tonight, as he walked towards Sarah, there was something in his eyes, something softer, something human, buried beneath the layers of power and ego. He wasn't here to make a grand speech or impress the world. He was here for something much more personal. For Sarah, the emotional stakes couldn't be clearer. She had given everything for her country, and yet, she was invisible. The woman who had once fought in a war was now a forgotten figure, existing only in the shadows of the life she once knew. Every passing day on the streets chipped away at her humanity, leaving only fragments of the woman she once was. Her fear was simple. She feared being forgotten. She feared that her existence, her struggles, would be swept aside without a second thought. But there was also something else, a quiet, burning anger. The world had used her, taken from her, and now it had left her behind. And she was tired of being ignored. She wanted someone to see her, to recognize her worth. She wanted her voice to matter again. For Trump, the stakes were more complex. He had everything, yet there was something lacking. He had spent his life building an empire, conquering everything in his path. But now, as he stood at the precipice of his legacy, he realized that no amount of success would ever fill the emptiness. The world saw him as a powerful man. But who was he really? Who was the man beneath the golden facade? He was haunted by the choices he had made, by the people he had hurt. Could he redeem himself? Could this encounter, this seemingly random meeting, change everything? There was a sense of destiny in the air. Fate had brought them together in this moment, and it would change them both. But what would that change look like? As they both navigated through their internal struggles, there were subtle hints of what was to come. Sarah's past, filled with loss and betrayal, haunted her every step. Her path seemed clear: survival, a fleeting sense of dignity, and maybe, just maybe, a chance at redemption. But the encounter with Trump would force her to confront more than just her circumstances. It would make her face her own fears, her deepest desires, and the parts of herself she had buried long ago. For Trump, the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. What was it that had driven him here, to this moment? Was it guilt, compassion, or something darker? The cracks in his facade were beginning to show, and as he walked closer to Sarah, the weight of his past seemed to press down on him. Both Sarah and Trump stood at a crossroads, unaware of how this moment would unfold. But the journey that lay ahead would test them both in ways they never expected. The encounter. The night air felt thick with anticipation as Sarah sat against the brick wall, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Her hand was tucked tightly into the folds of her jacket, clutching the last of her meager possessions, the only remnants of a life that felt so distant. The bustling street seemed so far away, the cacophony of passing cars and distant voices barely reaching her ears. She had learned to tune it all out, until she heard the engine of an approaching car. It wasn't the usual clatter of the city. It was smoother, quieter, almost deliberate. A sleek black SUV rolled to a stop in front of her, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a pair of piercing eyes. For a moment, Sarah hesitated, wondering if this was some cruel joke, if she was about to be forced back into the cold street for some petty reason. But then, the door opened. Out stepped a figure she didn't recognize at first, tall, imposing, his presence immediately commanding the space around him. He wore a suit that shimmered under the streetlights, but it was his eyes that caught her attention. There was something in them, something that made her freeze. "Are you all right?" The voice was low, almost gentle. It was a question that made no sense to her. What does it matter? She thought. The world had long since stopped caring for people like her. But here, in front of her, stood a man who should have been a stranger. Yet somehow, the familiarity of his voice stirred something deep inside her. She tried to push it aside, thinking that this was just another moment of misplaced kindness. But his gaze lingered, and her instinct, honed over years of survival, told her to hold on. There was something different about him. "Who are you?" she asked cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. The man gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile, a glint of recognition flashing across his face. "My name is Donald Trump," he said, his voice carrying a weight she wasn't prepared for. For a second, Sarah's mind couldn't process the words. The man standing before her was the same Donald Trump who had graced television screens for years, the billionaire businessman, the former president, the name everyone knew. But here he was, on the streets, facing her. This couldn't be real. She had lived through enough moments of broken hope to recognize an illusion when she saw one. Her breath caught in her chest as she stared at him. How was this possible? What did he want with her? A forgotten soul lost in the city. Her heart pounded, a rush of confusion and disbelief flooding her mind. "I didn't think," she trailed off, not sure what to say, the weight of the moment suffocating her. "What could someone like you possibly want from me?" Trump seemed to hesitate. The cold wind tousled his hair as he looked down at her, a moment of vulnerability creeping into his expression. "I've seen what's happening in this country," he said, his voice low but charged with something she couldn't quite place. "I've ignored it for too long. Maybe it's time to do something about it." As the minutes passed, a strange, almost surreal connection began to form between them. They spoke not of politics, not of the world's troubles, but of their own personal struggles. Sarah revealed the battle she fought, the war that never truly ended for her, the invisible scars that marked her soul. Trump, in turn, spoke not of his power, but of the emptiness that gnawed at him. His decisions had affected millions, yet in this moment, he seemed lost. A man standing in the shadow of his own legacy, searching for something that money and power had failed to provide. Sarah listened, and for the first time in a long while, someone listened to her, truly listened, without judgment. There was a rawness in the air between them, an honesty neither had expected. It wasn't a miracle, it wasn't a solution to the pain they both carried, but it was a step towards something different, something better. Sarah's walls, built over years of isolation and survival, began to crumble, piece by piece, as Trump's words touched her in places she thought were long dead. But just as she began to feel the warmth of this unexpected moment, something changed. A loud crash interrupted their conversation, and Sarah's heart dropped. The SUV, which had been parked nearby, suddenly jerked forward. From the corner of her eye, she saw a group of men approaching. They wore the telltale signs of danger: rough clothes, hard eyes, the kind of people who knew no mercy. "Get away from her," one of them shouted as he lunged at Trump. Trump didn't move. He didn't flinch, but Sarah could see the hesitation in his eyes, something that didn't sit right. He had made a promise to himself, to her, to do better, but now that promise seemed fragile in the face of this new danger. "Get out of here, Trump. This is none of your business," the man growled. Trump's face hardened, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it seemed like he might back down, just like he had done with so many others in the past. But then, something inside him snapped. He didn't retreat. Instead, he stepped forward. "This is exactly where I need to be," he said, his voice low and firm. The group of men hesitated, clearly thrown off by his sudden defiance. It was clear that they had expected him to cower, to run. But as Trump faced them, something in the air shifted. The situation, once so clear-cut, became murky, unpredictable. As the confrontation began to escalate, another figure emerged from the shadows, someone Sarah hadn't noticed before. She was too shocked to react, too confused to understand what was happening. The woman stepped forward, her face hidden beneath a hood. She seemed to be watching everything with a quiet intensity. But when she spoke, her words cut through the air with a chilling clarity. "Do you really think you can save her, Donald?" she asked, her voice like ice. "You've built your empire on the backs of people like her, and now you think you can change things? It's too late for that. The damage is already done." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She turned toward the woman, trying to understand her meaning. Was this a warning? A threat? She couldn't be sure, but one thing was clear. This wasn't the resolution she had hoped for. As the tension reached its peak, with Trump standing firm and the men closing in, Sarah realized something that shook her to the core. Trump hadn't come here to save her. He had come here to redeem himself. But at what cost? And in that moment, the truth became undeniable. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. The game had changed, and neither Sarah nor Trump knew how it would end. The tension in the air was palpable, every breath drawn with a mix of anticipation and dread. The group of men had closed in, their movements purposeful, their eyes filled with menace. Sarah stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to speak, to call out, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. Trump stood in front of her, an imposing figure, not backing down, his resolve hardening with each passing second. The atmosphere was thick with conflict, the very air seeming to vibrate with the intensity of the moment. Just as one of the men reached forward to grab Trump's collar, the sudden voice of the woman in the shadows sliced through the chaos. "Do you really think you can fix this, Donald?" Her voice was low and cutting, carrying with it a weight of truth that made Sarah's stomach drop. Trump's head turned sharply toward the woman, and for a brief second, his eyes were wide with confusion. The words hung in the air, pregnant with meaning, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah saw the vulnerability in Trump's eyes, like a mask slipping off to reveal something deeper. But before she could process it, the woman continued, her voice seeping through the tension. You can't just walk in here and play the hero. You built this system. You've profited off it. You can't escape that reality. Trump's posture shifted slightly, the facade of confidence beginning to crack. For the first time, there was doubt in his eyes. Sarah watched, her heart beating faster with a sudden realization. This wasn't what it seemed. There was more to this encounter than the apparent goodwill he had shown her. The woman's words weren't just accusations. They were truths that cut deeper than she had imagined. The men, seeing the shift in the atmosphere, took a step back, sensing an opening. But Sarah, still processing the woman's words, took a step forward, her voice breaking through the tension. What's going on? Who are you? She demanded, her voice shaking but fierce. The woman in the shadows smiled grimly, pulling her hood back to reveal her face. I'm the one who made sure people like her didn't get the help they needed, she said, her voice dripping with venom. And now, you're here trying to clean up your mess. Trump's face paled, his jaw clenched, his eyes flickering with something. Guilt, regret, anger. Before he turned towards Sarah. Don't listen to her, he said, his voice a little softer than usual, as if the weight of her words had knocked the wind out of him. I came here to help you. Sarah's chest tightened as she processed what she was hearing. The contradiction in his words was too much to ignore now. Trump wasn't just here as some benevolent figure offering help. He was here as a man who had played a part in the very system that had brought people like her to the streets. The woman had spoken the truth. He was part of the machine. And just like that, the fog lifted. The clarity was blinding. The man who had shown up with promises of redemption, the one who had seemed like a savior, wasn't exactly who he appeared to be. The realization hit Sarah like a tidal wave. She had been so desperate for change, for something to give her hope again, that she had failed to see the truth in front of her. Trump wasn't her savior. He was another man who had built his empire on the suffering of people like her. Tears welled up in her eyes, not just from the pain of betrayal, but from the gut-wrenching understanding that all her hopes, all the fleeting glimpses of trust she had allowed herself to believe in, had been shattered in a matter of seconds. The emotional walls she had spent years building, walls that kept her from feeling anything, began to crumble. You don't get it, Sarah's voice cracked, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. You never did. Trump's face twisted with confusion and a flicker of panic. You think I want this for you? For anyone? He gestured to the group of men, as if they were the source of everything wrong in her life. You think I've had it easy? You think I haven't paid the price for everything I've done? But Sarah shook her head, stepping back, her emotions a whirlwind. You've never paid the price. You've only taken more. And now you're here, standing in front of me, trying to fix what can't be fixed. But you can't. No one can. It was in this moment that the world seemed to stop. The revelation of Trump's true motives, his hidden intentions, didn't just shatter Sarah's illusion. It shattered her belief in the possibility of redemption itself. All the things she had held on to, all the things she thought she could trust, now lay broken at her feet. In that silence, the woman stepped forward again. Her words were calm, almost too calm. He can't help you, Sarah. He can't save you. No one can. This world was never built for people like us. It was a crushing blow, one that left Sarah feeling more alone than she had ever felt before. She had believed in a glimmer of hope, in a man who had promised her change, and now she was left with nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal. As the emotional weight of the moment settled in, a deep, unsettling truth began to form in the pit of Sarah's stomach. Nothing in her life would ever be as it seemed. Everyone, even the people who claimed to help, had their own agendas. And the one thing she had feared most, that no one could truly save her, was the one thing that had come to pass. The silence stretched on, hanging heavy in the air. The stage was set for what would come next, the fallout from the truth, the choices each character would make in the aftermath. Would Trump seek redemption in a different way? Would Sarah find a path to reclaim the trust she had lost? Or would they both be swallowed by the very world they had tried to change? As the camera held the tension, the screen seemed to freeze in that moment of emotional collapse, leaving the audience breathless, waiting for the fallout to unfold. The tension had been building for days, each word exchanged, each glance lingering, pulling the characters closer to the inevitable moment of reckoning. But now, standing in front of the crowd of men, Sarah felt it all collapse in on her. The ground beneath her feet felt unsteady, as if the earth itself was betraying her, just like everyone else in her life. The air was thick with the acrid scent of tension, and the silence felt suffocating. An eerie pause before the storm. Trump stood only a few feet away, his face a mask of confusion and hurt, but Sarah could see the cracks. His confidence, once so imposing, now seemed fragile, like a house of cards about to tumble. She could hear the muffled voices of the men around her, their hushed murmurs growing in volume, but her focus was entirely on Trump. He had been the one to offer help, to offer hope, until everything came crashing down. The woman who had exposed him stood just a few steps behind, watching with cold, calculating eyes. "I don't need your pity." Sarah's voice cut through the stillness, louder now, a steady fury burning through her words. She looked at Trump, not with anger, but with a quiet, steely resolve. "I don't need you to fix anything. I can stand on my own." Trump's eyes widened, the weight of her words sinking in. But then, he took a step forward, his voice rising with urgency, almost pleading. "You don't understand. Everything I've done, it's for you. It's for people like you." The room seemed to shrink as Sarah's gaze locked onto his. The harsh light above flickered, casting shadows that danced wildly across the room, as if the world itself couldn't bear to witness the unraveling of everything they had fought for. "No," her voice was steady, her every word deliberate. "It's never been for me. It's for you. You've been playing a game, Donald. And now, I'm done being a pawn." The words echoed in the room, and for a moment, there was only silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. The tension was so thick that Sarah could barely breathe. It felt as if the air itself had thickened, her every exhale cutting through the oppressive weight of the moment. Trump's face contorted as the realization hit him. He took a step back, shaking his head, as if trying to push away the truth that was crashing over him like a wave. "I never wanted to hurt you," he muttered, his voice strained, barely above a whisper. "I never meant for it to turn out like this." But Sarah's eyes didn't soften. The time for forgiveness had passed. The illusion of who Trump was had crumbled, and in its place stood a man who had betrayed her, and countless others, by feeding into a broken system, a system that had stripped away any hope she had left. Suddenly, the quiet murmur of the men in the background erupted into chaos. One of the men, who had been watching the exchange with growing impatience, lunged forward. "Enough of this. If you won't take the help, then leave." His voice was sharp, dangerous, as his hand reached for Trump's shoulder. The action triggered a chain reaction. Another man surged forward, pushing Sarah roughly aside. But she didn't fall. Instead, she caught herself, her body swaying with the force of the push. In that instant, everything within her snapped. Years of anger, betrayal, and pain flooded to the surface, and she did the unthinkable. Without a second thought, she grabbed the nearest object, a broken piece of metal from the floor, and swung it toward the man who had shoved her. The impact was deafening, sending the man staggering back. The room exploded into chaos. Men shouting, people scrambling, fists flying. Everything was a blur of motion and sound. But in the center of it all, Sarah remained calm. It was as if she were outside her own body, watching everything unfold. She had finally reached the point where survival mattered more than anything. It wasn't about Trump anymore. It was about her, about reclaiming control over her own life. In the midst of the chaos, Trump was shoved backward, his body colliding with the wall, knocking the breath from his lungs. For a moment, he seemed dazed, disoriented, like a man who had realized too late that the very system he had built was now crumbling beneath him. Sarah stood in the center, the metal still clutched in her hand. She looked at Trump, who was now rising from the ground. His eyes locked on her with something unreadable. Regret, anger, and maybe even fear. But there was one thing that had become painfully clear. This moment, this confrontation, was the culmination of everything. There was no going back. "Leave," Sarah said, her voice cold, cutting through the noise of the room. "Go back to your world, Donald. There's nothing here for you anymore." Trump didn't respond immediately. He hesitated, as if considering her words. Then, slowly, with one last look at Sarah, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the silent aftermath of the chaos. The men who had once surrounded him now stood still, unsure of what to do, their movements sluggish as if caught in the weight of the moment. As the dust settled and the echoes of violence faded, Sarah was left standing in the middle of the room, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from her body. The tension, the anger, the betrayal. It all seemed to dissipate into the air, leaving her standing alone, but in control. It had taken everything to get here, every ounce of strength, every moment of doubt. But now, in this quiet, strange calm, Sarah realized something. She had survived. She had made the decision that would define her future, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. The camera lingered on her face, the final shot capturing the weary, determined look in her eyes. The screen seemed to hold its breath, the weight of the climax lingering in the air, leaving the audience stunned, unable to look away from the raw, powerful transformation they had just witnessed. The moment of truth had arrived, and everything had changed. The chaos had finally subsided, but the room still felt heavy, as if it had absorbed the weight of everything that had just transpired. Sarah stood alone in the center, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The anger that had burned so brightly moments before now flickered faintly, its intensity fading as the adrenaline left her body. For the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself to breathe, deeply, deliberately, as though she were tasting air for the first time. The men who had once been her antagonists now seemed distant, their faces uncertain. There was no more shouting, no more threats. They were simply figures in the background, their relevance slipping away as Sarah's gaze fixed forward, focusing on nothing in particular, but everything all at once. She found herself thinking about the events that had led her here. How a simple decision, one moment of defiance, had unraveled the fabric of her life. She had been a woman searching for hope, for a way out of the endless cycle of disappointment. But now, as she stood here, she realized something profound. She had found something much more important than escape. She had found her voice. "I didn't need him." The thought rang in her mind like a bell. Trump's words, his promises, they no longer held any sway over her. She had learned the painful truth that no one, not even someone as powerful as him, could save her. Only she could do that. The weight of that realization was both liberating and terrifying. As Sarah took her first few steps toward the door, her eyes lingered on the space where Trump had stood just moments ago. The part of her that had once looked for validation, for approval from powerful figures, was now gone. In its place stood a woman who understood that true strength came from within, and that no external force could dictate her worth. Outside, the world was still and quiet. The harshness of the earlier conflict had been replaced by an eerie calm. Sarah's footsteps were steady now, each one purposeful, the weight of the battle behind her. She had fought not just for survival but for herself. As she walked, her mind reflected on everything she had endured. Her gaze shifted to the horizon ahead, to the possibilities that stretched before her. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace. She had been tested, and though the wounds would take time to heal, she knew she was stronger now than she had ever been. But just as Sarah reached the edge of the room, about to exit the world that had held her captive for so long, she turned back. The door was still open, and for a moment, she stared into the emptiness behind her. In that brief pause, she allowed herself to remember, not just the pain or the betrayal, but the small glimmers of kindness, the people who had tried to help, the fleeting moments where hope had seemed possible. And then, just as quickly, she closed the door, leaving the past behind her, but carrying its lessons forward. The camera lingered on Sarah's face one last time, her expression calm yet resolute. There was no grand victory, no applause, no acknowledgement of what had been lost or gained. just a woman walking away from her past toward an unknown future. The resolution wasn't about tying up every loose end. It was about the quiet power of reclaiming one's life. As the screen began to fade, Sarah's voice echoed softly, a final thought that encapsulated the journey she had undertaken. Sometimes, you don't need to change the world around you to find your place in it. Sometimes, you just need to change yourself. The screen faded to black, leaving the audience in the lingering silence, the weight of Sarah's words heavy in the air. And with that, the story ended, leaving behind not just answers, but the profound realization that redemption, growth, and strength often come from the most unexpected places. As the dust settles and the story reaches its end, there's one question that echoes in the minds of all who have witnessed Sarah's journey. What does it truly mean to be free? Throughout the twists, betrayals, and moments of profound emotional struggle, Sarah's journey wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming her own power in a world that often tries to strip it away. She didn't just fight against external forces. She fought against her own doubts, her fears, and the part of herself that had once believed she needed someone else to save her. In the end, what she learned, and what we should all take from this story, is that freedom isn't something that can be handed to you. It's something you must take for yourself. But be warned, the cost of that freedom is often greater than we expect. Sometimes, we must betray others to save ourselves, but the cost is never what we expect. We all make decisions, some driven by love, others by fear, and sometimes by sheer survival. Sarah's choices weren't easy, but they were hers to make, and they led her to a place of self-realization, even if it meant breaking away from people she once thought she needed. So, I want you to reflect on this. If you were in Sarah's shoes, would you have made the same decisions? Would you have chosen to betray trust in order to find your own truth? Or would you have stayed, clinging to loyalty, no matter the cost? What is the price of loyalty? Is it always worth it? Can loyalty be a weakness, especially when it holds you back from becoming the person you're meant to be? As you ponder these questions, think about your own life. Where have you been faced with choices that tested your integrity, your sense of self-worth, or your loyalty to others? And what were the consequences of those decisions? The true test of character often comes when we are forced to confront our darkest moments. And in those moments, it's not about what happens to us. It's about what we do with the power we've been given. I challenge you to think, what will you do with your own power? Let these questions linger and carry them with you. Because, just like Sarah, we all have moments where the road ahead is unclear, but it's our choices, how we respond to the challenges, that define us. And with that, I leave you to reflect on your own journey. What will your story be?